Have you ever wondered what happens when the applause fades, and the body that carried the rhythm for half a century begins to fail? At 78, Mick Fleetwood, the towering, unmistakable heartbeat behind Fleetwood Mac, no longer looks invincible. Recent footage shows his once steady hands trembling slightly as he signs autographs. His voice, deep and familiar, sometimes cracks mid-sentence, as if even his words are tired from the decades they've traveled. The man who once pounded drums with primal force before tens of thousands now rises slowly from chairs, careful, deliberate, aware of every joint and every ache. The stage lights that once seemed eternal have dimmed. After Christine McVie's death, the devastating Maui wildfires that destroyed his beloved restaurant, and years of physical strain from touring, many close to him quietly admit what no one wants to say out loud: time is catching up. But how did this story really begin? How does a boy raised in post-war Britain, in a country still counting its rations, grow into one of rock's most enduring figures, only to stand decades later facing fragility instead of thunderous applause? And when the music stops, what remains? A boy in a world rebuilding. Mick Fleetwood was born Michael John Kells Fleetwood in 1947 in Redruth, Cornwall, into a Britain still recovering from the scars of World War II. Food was rationed. Money was scarce. Buildings stood half-repaired, like wounded soldiers slowly knitting back together. His father, John Fleetwood, served in the Royal Air Force, disciplined, orderly, precise. His mother, Bridget, possessed warmth and creativity, nurturing imagination in a home where luxury was rare but curiosity was encouraged. In the Fleetwood household, routine ruled the day. Shoes were polished. Beds were made. Voices were measured. Yet from the radio came something softer, looser, jazz drifting like smoke through the air. It was subtle, almost polite, but it stirred something in young Mick. Even before he understood rhythm, he felt it. When his father's service took the family first to Wales and later to Egypt, the young boy encountered a wider world than many British children ever would. In Cairo, the heat pressed against the skin like a living thing. Street musicians filled marketplaces with layered percussion, hand drums echoing against ancient stone. African rhythms, hypnotic, cyclical, almost spiritual, seeped into his consciousness. While other boys back in England might have absorbed only skiffle and early rock, Mick was absorbing global pulse. He didn't yet know what it meant. But the patterns stayed with him. Isn't it fascinating how something you hear once as a child can echo across an entire lifetime? The first drum kit. At 13, awkward and already unusually tall, Mick convinced his parents to let him have a drum kit. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't high-end. But it was his. In the cramped London flat where the family later settled, he practiced obsessively. Neighbors complained about the noise. His hands blistered. His wrists ached. His timing wavered. But something inside him insisted on pushing forward. He wasn't a natural virtuoso in the technical sense. He didn't blaze through complicated fills. He didn't dazzle with speed. Instead, he focused on feel, the invisible glue between notes. He wanted the groove to breathe. Would you have kept going if the world around you said you weren't good enough yet? As a teenager, he haunted Soho jazz clubs, absorbing wisdom from drummers who valued restraint over flash. He learned that space could be as powerful as sound. He learned that ego destroyed bands faster than missed beats. Those lessons became foundational. Yet early attempts at joining bands were humbling. He was 6 feet 6 inches, lanky, sometimes clumsy. In small rehearsal rooms, he seemed to fold himself awkwardly behind kits. Rejections piled up. To support himself, he worked odd jobs, from dishwashing to short-term labor, funneling money back into music lessons. There were cold nights sleeping in vans after gigs at rough pubs. There were arguments mid-performance. Once, during a particularly chaotic show, frustration boiled over and he smashed his drum kit, not in rockstar rebellion, but in raw insecurity. Every setback left a mark. But every setback also hardened him. The birth of Fleetwood Mac. By 1967, London's blues scene was thriving. American blues had crossed the Atlantic and found fertile ground among British musicians hungry for authenticity. It was in this environment that Mick crossed paths with guitarist Peter Green, intense, gifted, and deeply sensitive. Together, they formed Fleetwood Mac, named almost casually after Mick Fleetwood and bassist John McVie. The name would eventually become iconic, but at the time it was simply practical. Their blues-driven sound resonated quickly. Songs like Black Magic Woman carried a dark, simmering energy. Albatross, a haunting instrumental released in 1969, drifted like a sonic horizon line, serene, spacious, and utterly different from the chaos of the era. Albatross reached #1 in the UK and reportedly influenced even the Beatles. For a brief moment, it seemed like the band had found both identity and stability. But stability was an illusion. The first fractures. Fame amplifies everything: talent, ego, vulnerability, weakness. Peter Green, the band's creative nucleus, struggled with increasing LSD use. During a tour in Munich in 1970, something shifted profoundly. He began speaking about renouncing wealth. He wore robes. He appeared spiritually unmoored. Then one night, he walked off stage. Imagine being Mick Fleetwood in that moment. The band's visionary, your closest friend, unraveling before your eyes. Protect the music, or protect the man. Mick made the brutal choice to fire Peter Green, hoping distance might help him recover. It was a decision that haunted him for years. But turmoil didn't end there. Guitarist Danny Kirwan spiraled into alcoholism, culminating in an on-stage breakdown so severe Mick had no choice but to dismiss him. Later, guitarist Bob Weston's affair with Mick's wife collapsed a tour entirely. As if that weren't enough, their manager once sent out a fake version of Fleetwood Mac to tour under the band's name, claiming legal ownership. Lawsuits followed. Equipment was pawned. Finances dwindled. How many bands would have survived even one of those catastrophes? Yet somehow, through sheer stubbornness and Mick's relentless belief in the band's future, Fleetwood Mac endured. Christine, the anchor. In the eye of the storm stood Christine McVie. Calm, melodic, emotionally intelligent. Her songwriting offered warmth and clarity when everything else felt chaotic. Say You Love Me, Over My Head. Her songs were intimate but universal. Behind closed doors, though, her marriage to bassist John McVie was deteriorating. Arguments simmered. Silence thickened. The band's chemistry became a web of fractured relationships. Mick often stepped into the role of mediator, holding fragile threads together. He believed in the band not just as a business, but as a living organism. If one limb faltered, the whole body suffered. By 1974, exhausted and financially strained, Fleetwood Mac relocated to Los Angeles, chasing reinvention. Would this be their final gamble? The Buckingham Nicks spark. On New Year's Eve 1974, Mick visited Sound City Studios. There, he heard a demo by a California duo, Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks. The music shimmered, intricate guitar work intertwined with a voice that sounded both ancient and fiercely modern. Mick sensed destiny. He invited them to join Fleetwood Mac, knowing it would shift the band's DNA entirely. It was a risk. It was a leap across continents and styles. But it felt right. The 1975 self-titled album exploded in America. Rhiannon felt mystical and defiant. Landslide whispered vulnerability. Over My Head offered quiet longing. The band had reinvented itself yet again. But behind the harmonies, relationships imploded. Stevie and Lindsey's romance collapsed in slow, painful stages. Christine and John finalized their divorce. And Mick, already navigating his own crumbling marriage, began an affair with Stevie. The band became an emotional powder keg. Rumors, pain as art. Out of heartbreak emerged Rumors in 1977, an album forged in emotional wreckage. Recording sessions were grueling. Cocaine flowed freely. Arguments erupted. Songs became letters never directly spoken. Go Your Own Way was Lindsey's barely veiled message to Stevie. Dreams was Stevie's response, cool, cutting, immortal. Christine's Don't Stop looked forward even as everything behind them burned. Mick, seated behind the drums, became both participant and observer, holding tempo while personal lives unraveled around him. How do you keep time when your own heart feels offbeat? Rumors sold over 40 million copies worldwide. It became one of the best-selling albums of all time. Success beyond imagination. Yet emotionally, the band was barely holding together. Excess and collapse. The late 1970s and 1980s brought unimaginable wealth, and reckless spending. Mick invested in failed business ventures. He trusted the wrong advisors. Lavish lifestyles swallowed fortunes whole. By the mid-1980s, despite selling millions of records, Mick Fleetwood found himself nearly bankrupt. How does someone at the peak of fame lose everything? The answer wasn't one catastrophic mistake, but 1,000 small ones: unchecked spending, poor management, misplaced trust. Pride made asking for help difficult. He filed for bankruptcy in 1984. For a man who had anchored one of the most successful bands in history, it was humbling beyond words. Reinvention, again. But Mick had always been resilient. He rebuilt finances through touring. He launched businesses, including Fleetwood's on Front Street in Maui, a restaurant that became a community hub. Maui wasn't just a business venture, it was sanctuary. The ocean's rhythm mirrored his lifelong connection to beat and flow. He found peace walking beaches at dawn, reflecting on decades of chaos. Then in 2023, wildfires tore through Lahaina. His restaurant was destroyed. Memories reduced to ash. How many times can one life be forced to start over? Loss and legacy. Christine McVie's death in 2022 struck deeply. She had been steady ground beneath shifting tides. Without her, the idea of Fleetwood Mac felt incomplete. Mick spoke publicly about grief, not dramatically, but quietly. Age makes loss more immediate. Friends are no longer distant chapters, they are vanishing co-authors of your story. Today, Mick Fleetwood moves slower. Interviews reveal a man reflective rather than restless. He speaks about gratitude, about mistakes, about love lost and found. He knows the tours are likely over. But what defines a legacy? Is it chart positions, album sales, stadium crowds? Or is it the invisible way music threads itself into people's lives? Weddings, heartbreaks, long drives, lonely nights. The final beat. When you watch him now, tall still, but gentler in presence, what strikes you first isn't a faded superstar, it's completion. His gait is slower, his laugh softer, and his hands sometimes tremble, but there's no collapse in his bearing. There is, instead, the look of someone who spent a lifetime learning how to keep a complicated machine moving. The music, the friendships, the money, the wounds. A drummer who learned early that rhythm isn't an exhibition of perfection, it's the stubborn insistence to keep going. Have you ever noticed how a great groove doesn't shout? It supports. It carries. It holds others up. When Mick plays, or when he isn't playing but is lending his sense of time to the room, it's almost invisible in its generosity. That discretion is his gift. This is a man for whom the stage has been both sanctuary and battlefield. For decades, Mick Fleetwood kept time not only for a band, but for a generation. He was the backbone you could trust to stay steady while the rest of the thing fractured and reformed around him. And yet, even a backbone can ache. Even a steady hand can tremble. Think back to the hotel room in Boston. The bright, antiseptic light, the smell of stale cigarette smoke and stale adrenaline, the frantic clatter of road crew voices muffled through the door. In a single, terrifying hour, the band's future almost stopped. Mick overdosed on heroin, roadies and medics dragged him back from the edge with CPR, the show went on as if nothing had happened. How close did rock history come to ending in that hotel room? What small, nearly invisible mercies keep us from ruin? Success offered them the world and the peril that came with it. Rumors, born in 1977 out of heartbreak, betrayal, and excess, became the altar everyone worshipped. It sold over 40 million copies. Songs like Go Your Own Way and Dreams felt less like pop tunes and more like public confessions, their visceral honesty cutting through the lacquer of celebrity. But the money that flooded in was a double-edged sword. At night, the band's apartments and hotel rooms became laboratories for indulgence. Fortunes were spent as quickly as they arrived. Tax problems from the UK, embezzlement by an accountant, repeated declarations of bankruptcy, the ledger of excess read like a Greek tragedy. How do you measure the cost of creative freedom when the price is personal ruin? Mick's story isn't only about calamity. It's also about choices made with stubborn conviction. He personally financed Tusk, an album that critics admired for its daring and fans initially rejected. Tusk lost money, but Mick would later insist it was one of their most honest records. What matters more, the immediate validation of sales, or the later vindication of artistic risk? Fans and finance often disagree, artists live somewhere in the crosshairs of both. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the story of Fleetwood Mac reads like a series of temporary healings. A member leaves, the band splinters, lawsuits flare, tempers cool, and a reunion is announced, sometimes sincere, sometimes provisional. Lindsay left, Stevie left, Christine stepped back, tensions that looked solved later reopened. Tour buses crashed, musicians played through injuries, Mick on stage with a bandaged wrist after a wreck, another night performing with a collapsed lung. When you stand under the hot lights and the thousands are cheering, what do you owe them? Everything. Or merely to continue until you can no longer. There were moments of public reconciliation that felt almost mythic. In 1993, the classic lineup performed Don't Stop at Bill Clinton's inauguration gala. The wounds looked for a beat as if they might seal. In 2003, a reunion tour grossed nearly $70 million. The chemistry between them, volatile but undiminished, still drew crowds. Why do we keep returning to music born from conflict? Perhaps because it mirrors our own messy lives. Love and betrayal, reinvention and resentment, the messy work of forgiveness. Do we go back to those songs because they make us feel less alone? Even as decades pass, the past keeps rescuing and punishing him in ways no drama could script. In November 2022, Christine McVie, his soulmate within the band, the emotional glue who smoothed rough edges, died after a stroke. Mick called her that soulmate. Her absence was not merely professional, it felt anatomical, like a missing organ in a body long used to moving in particular ways. How does one rebuild when both a musical partner and a cornerstone of one's emotional life are gone? Not long after, the Maui wildfires took something else irreplaceable, Fleetwood's on Front Street, Mick's restaurant, and with it, decades of mementos, photographs, and artifacts that had been touchstones to his life and legend. Imagine walking into a kitchen and finding that the trophies, the backstage passes, the handwritten notes that stitched your past together, gone. How do you grieve an archive of yourself? Can the things that remember you be replaced by memory alone? Yet the story refuses to be only a catalogue of loss. There are glints of renewal and reconciliation, small bright moments that suggest the rhythm continues, altered but unbroken. In 2025, Mick reunited in the studio with Lindsey Buckingham to collaborate on new music for Miley Cyrus. Observers called it healing. The act of making music with an old adversary is, in itself, a kind of forgiveness, even if formal reunion remains uncertain. When two people who once broke each other's hearts sit across a mixing console and find a common measure, what does that teach us about the limits of grievance? In April 2025, he stood on stage in Cleveland to induct Bad Company into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The sight was bittersweet. Hands that had once thundered drums still held a stick, but trembled. His voice faltered when he spoke. Decades of drumming and an old lung injury had left traces. Yet his pride in the music, in younger artists and the long arc of rock history, was unmistakable. Is legacy simply the sum of trophies and records, or is it the impulse to point the next generation toward the light? Mick's relationship to money was as dramatic as his relationship to music. There is a humility in hearing someone who once had fortune say, plainly, that they burned through riches chasing excess and creative freedom. Bankruptcy filings, bad investments, the volatility of fame, they carved out a new kind of education. How different is the lesson when you learn it with $1 million bank account behind you versus learning it with an empty wallet? At the heart of all of these public sagas is a private man, someone who loved fiercely and often clumsily, who made mistakes in the arena of his own life and sometimes paid dearly for them. Those who know Mick describe him as generous, messy, sentimental, and stubbornly forgiving. He kept a habit of collecting people, roadies, younger musicians, friends, and somehow finding ways to keep them involved. He created not just a band but a community. When a leader's hands start to fail, what replaces them? Who holds the charts, the cues, the long memory? For Mick, part of the answer became mentoring, staying present for younger artists, guiding them with the patient rhythm of someone who has been around the block enough times to know how to survive. And perhaps that's the crucial lesson he leaves us with: survival is not synonymous with triumph. Survival is a different kind of artistry. It takes stubbornness, forgiveness, and reinvention, the willingness to keep the groove even when the solos hurt. He's no longer the wild-eyed giant pounding a massive bass drum in platform boots. He's demonstrably human. Time strips away the illusion of immortality, and what's left is endurance. What will people remember when the lights finally go down? The scandals, The affairs and lawsuits? The headlines that once shouted scandal and then moved on? Or will they remember the songs that stitched their lives together? The late-night heartbreaks, the first slow dances, the songs that kept them company through divorces and promotions, births and funerals? For many who grew up with Fleetwood Mac as the soundtrack to love, loss, and reinvention, Mick's story feels personal. It is a reminder that talent alone isn't enough. It takes stubbornness, reparations, and a capacity to reinvent oneself, to find new measures when the old ones no longer fit. Now, as his body slows and his circle grows smaller, Mick still speaks of reconciliation. He honors Christine's memory and speaks, with a soft hope, about Stevie and Lindsay possibly standing side by side again. He knows legacies aren't built on flawless harmony. They're built on people who refuse to quit. What does it mean to leave a legacy? Is it the sound that outlives you, the records that spin in basements and earbuds alike? Or is it the lives you touched, the musicians you helped form, the small kindnesses a stranger remembers because you made room for them? When the final curtain truly falls, will it feel like an ending or simply another measure in a song that never really stops? For Mick Fleetwood, the answer seems clear: not perfection, not even stability, but persistence. Even as his hands shake, the beat goes on, softer, internal, steady as breath. And if you close your eyes, you can still hear it, not a single thunderous stroke, but the patient insistence that whatever comes next, the music will keep time.